Hello and welcome back to a brand new episode of the My Generation podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in over the past few episodes. Let me know what you thought of last week's if you tuned in. Quite a long listen along with Daniel Inwood, our returning podcast guest. Such a fun one to record. Let me know in the comments first what you thought of that episode, and do stay subscribed to the My Generation podcast to hear more content like this. Today we are talking about what does art mean to you? What is art? Now I wanted to start by going through some of my personal stories. I've also got a quote from a book, What is Culture For? And I've also got your comments on Facebook and Instagram that I've been collecting over the past few days, just briefly summing up exactly what you, the listeners, think art means to you. And that's great to get some responses in. If you would like to potentially get your comment in for a future episode of the My Generation podcast, do contact the Facebook page at the My Generation podcast. Links are all in the description and you can have your say there. And stay subscribed so you can always get involved in the podcast. Now into what art means for me. The book I was reading, What is Culture For?, really prompted me to think about this question reflectively about my past, because I've always been a writer. I've always been a photographer as well, and newly now getting into podcast work. But most of my early forms of art, if you can say, was a novel I wrote as a kid it went absolutely nowhere, but the process of getting my thoughts out onto the page and stories that I wanted to tell was very important and healthy for me. For me, art is a place for me to put myself out fully. I'm quite an open person when I'm talking on these podcasts. When I write, I put a lot of myself in it. You could say, wear my heart on my sleeve, and I don't shy away from saying what I'm truly feeling. And I feel like writing is a good place for me to put a lot of that in my plays, whether it's through characters, whether it's through situations, whether it's through specific arguments or successes or conflicts. They're often things that I'm thinking about and situations I've been in. And going back and looking at my old writing narratively tells me a lot about how I used to be. Now, for a lot of people, art may come in the form of things like paintings, and I've always been an appreciator of visual arts, but I've not been an amazing contributor. I can't draw at all. I can only really do any form of visual work through photography and film, and I've always took a more directorial role when it came to film because I like the overall vision. When it comes to art, I like to see the biggest possible picture and work things down into steps rather than being a cog in the machine. I like to oversee the whole machine. I'm definitely someone who, I take it through my murder mysteries that I run. I run solo murder mysteries that I write myself and then present myself, and I run this podcast, and I find that when I'm thinking of my own new ideas and able to bounce them off of people that I work with, it's a lot easier for me to work. I like putting my ideas on a stage. Theatrically, I think it's very, very obvious to me reading my recent plays what emotions I am trying to discuss and discover, whether they be to do with personal work, my jobs, and just things that humans feel. I think that, and it definitely explores it very well in the book, which I'm going to link to in the description below the book I'm going to be referring to, because it just taught me quite a lot about how we all view art and why it's something that we should be very aware of. The idea of reacting and being emotional to art is very important. The idea of crying at a movie or at a song, or and this can be overwhelmed with positive or reflective or negative emotion. Just being overwhelmed by emotion at a piece of art, no matter what medium it's in, is very, very important. The ability to there's a great example in the book where it talks about a man breaking down in tears at a painting in a museum. Now, do you throw the man out of the museum for the risk of him damaging the artwork, or do you let him feel the art? And I think that's something that now going forward I want to think about when I'm doing my writing. What emotions do I want others to feel? Because my art is now not only, as it has been when I was younger, just a process of me allowing my emotions to paint on a page, but instilling emotions and discussions and thoughts into people that I want to discuss. So I like to talk about online quite a lot, technology, the way we're moving with technology, and family and close personal relationships. I like to discuss those quite frequently in my plays because I think they're quite important. Also, the idea of finding your career, especially when I was a bit young, sort of 16 to 18, and I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do with my life. A lot of my plays were very focused on career-driven characters finding careers. And so that is loosely what art means to me. But I just wanted to read an extract from a page from the book, What is Culture For? So on page 16 of the book, in the chapter Companionship, it reads, "The greatest share of art that humans have ever made for one another has had one thing in common. It has dealt, in one form or another, with sorrow. Unhappy love, poverty, discrimination, anxiety, rivalry, regret, shame, isolation, and longing. These have been the chief constituents of art down the years. However, we are, in public discussion, often unhelpfully coy about the extent of our grief. The chat tends to be upbeat or glib. We are under awesome pressure to keep smiling in order not to shock, provide ammunition for the enemies, or sap the energy of the vulnerable. We therefore end up not only sad, but sad that we are sad, without much public information of the essential normality of our melancholy." And I think that it's definitely worth reading the rest of this book. I will again link it in the description. And I know that might sound like quite a pessimistic section that I've just taken from the book, but I think it is exploring something very important that I hadn't really realised up until recently, which is the idea of, if you're feeling an emotion, you should be able to feel it. And I think that is what art is about. There are certain films, very specifically for me, that I have very, very strong emotional connections to. The first being Moon by Duncan Jones, starring Sam Rockwell. It's one of my favourite movies. It deals with loneliness in such a interesting way. How people feel in terms of what their life means, does it matter, and do you feel like just a number? I'd really recommend that movie. It changed me as a person, and I'm just listing off here a few movies that really made me feel something strong. The next movie I wanted to refer to was Her, which came out in 2013 and is by Spike Jonze and starring Joaquin Phoenix. And again, this is one of my favourite movies because of the way it deals with relationships, not only romantic but personal, dealing with romantic relationships in quite a technological way. And obviously I like to talk about personal relationships and technology quite a lot, so this seemed like one of the perfect movies for me to watch. And the way it deals with love, what love means, what relationships mean. I saw this when I was quite a lot younger, hadn't been in a relationship before when I saw this, and this movie just generated so many thoughts for me about what the idea of really loving something or someone is, what can often at times be selfish, what at times is distant, whether you take advantage of it or not. And the way it explored that so tragically just really, really hit me, and in a very interesting way. It was one of those movies I don't think I'll ever forget. The next movie, and again, I actually talk about some of these movies in a little bit more detail in the episode 8 we did, which was about films that changed you. So I'm briefly going over some of the films I mentioned in that with just similar angles. And don't forget that you can also listen back to that episode. It is on the page, although the sound quality is a bit different on that because I filmed that one outside. And I'm just going into a little bit more of different detail in this about how it affected me emotionally rather than just why I enjoyed the movie. Next is I'm actually going to talk about my favourite movie, The Fountain, which came out in 2006 by Darren Aronofsky. And it's always, up until me seeing this movie, been quite difficult for me to pin down my favourite movie, but this one has to be it. It discusses life, what it means, what death means, and it actually paints the idea of dying in a beautiful light. It makes death not something to be feared, and not something to long for. It makes death something that leads to new life, very regenerative. It's not just a reincarnation story either. It's very, very empowering. It's about coping with loss. And I think that that's something that we can definitely all relate to. And under the quote that I referred to from the book, the reason why I think a film like this is important is, under the circumstances of dealing with loss, having an outlet that can make you feel emotions relating to your grief quite fully, and being able to experience it, because sometimes you can pent emotions up. And a movie like this really helped me release some emotion that I was feeling at the time when I saw it, because you are seeing something that's triggering the memories to come back. It's triggering you to be reflective, contemplative, and think about how it applies to your life. It makes you search inward, and that's not just about the brilliance of this movie, because there's so many movies, books, plays, songs, things that just do that. In fact, there's some songs that just for me are absolutely stunning. Adagio in D minor, which was from the soundtrack of Sunshine, which came out in 2007. I believe that's a Danny Boyle movie, but do not quote me on that. And that song's just so visceral for me. It paints a picture of a world that's so much more grand than I can even consider. It makes me think about places beyond the stars. It's a beautiful song. And the book, What is Culture For, also has a great discussion about what it means with music, because sometimes we can't always put everything we want to articulate into words, and that music can actually have a greater impact on us than we can ever realize. So now, again, I do apologise that this is a slightly shorter episode, wanting to keep the episode lengths very varied, because we want to go through so many different styles of episode. I want to do longer form, shorter form, more complex discussions, ones that revolve around clips, comments, talking with guests, and we've got guests lined up for so many more up-and-coming episodes. But I hope you enjoyed so far the chat between just me and you sat here today talking about art and what it all means. But now we're going to head over to the social media. We're going to head over to Facebook and Instagram. You can find the My Generation Podcast Facebook link in the description, but on all of my social media accounts, I put out the question asking you all what art means to you, and I just wanted to have a little discussion about what they mean. So, just as a plane flies overhead, we are going to be going to Georgia. Georgia says art is something to expand your mind. And I think what Georgia is trying to definitely articulate here is that art opens your perspectives. You see things that you haven't seen before, considered things you haven't considered before. And art can be narrative or non-fiction, I believe. And I think that under Georgia's situation here, she's consuming a lot of art that's things that aren't very similar to her current situation. It's expanding your mind, it's expanding things that you think about. Next we have Sam. Sam also messaged in on Facebook, thank you Sam, saying that something created with the intention to invoke a sentiment or idea. I like to keep my definition of art very broad, and I'd agree with that, the idea of keeping it broad, because it includes so many mediums, and people's love of art definitely transcends all mediums. Something to invoke a sentiment or idea. That's, again, similar to what we've been talking about already. It's about making you feel something emotionally. It's not about just passively viewing art. And I think that's something that the book touches on, about the idea of when you consume art, consuming it as full as you possibly can. Not just walking around a museum and passively looking at something, but considering it, what does it all mean? And without trying to sound obviously pretentious with it either, you don't want to look at something and create meaning that it doesn't have to you. You need to look really internally at what art means to you. And interestingly, before I move on to the next comment, I would like to encourage you all to, if possible, send a sound bite in of a piece of art that has inspired you. A piece of art, a piece of a film, a song, just something, a 30-second clip of how something has inspired you that made you feel full emotions, specific examples. Either put a comment below or send in a soundbite to the Facebook page or a message, and we'll work out how to get it sent to us, sending your soundbites. And I'll try and feature some of them in the podcast, because getting a feel of emotion from a piece of art would be absolutely amazing for me to get on the show. Also, interestingly, Connor Jenkins and I, who I recorded the 6th episode of the podcast with, he is going to be back on the show soon talking about the power of music, and we need your comments about that. We're specifically doing a whole episode about the power of music, so please do get your comments in. Put them in the description, Facebook, any way you can. We will be going to your comments about the power of music so we can understand how that one specific form of art is influencing you. I have some specific ideas and stories that I want to discuss in that episode, but I really want to talk about them then, so I'm going to leave the more musical aspect for now to that episode. Going back to your comments, Paige messages in on Facebook. Paige says, I've been painting for over 10 years now, done multiple projects and commission pieces for clients, and for me it's a form of escapism, expressionism, and a way to make something out of nothing. It's exciting how you are a single concept, and who knows which avenue out of the 100 you could take it. It's bringing that concept and seeing it come to life, which is amazing. Thank you for that lovely, long, eloquent paragraph there, Paige, on the Facebook page. I am going to briefly touch over a few of your points. So we had escapism that you mentioned first. I like that as an idea. I used to do a lot of writing after school because it was a way to keep me away from mindlessly playing video games. Although video games have their place, I felt I was quite addicted. So writing that novel as a kid really kept me focused. It kept me in flow. It kept me thinking, and it kept me putting out the emotions that I wanted to get out onto the page. I like that expressionism. Paige is an amazing artist. I'll do what I can see if I can get Paige on the podcast to talk about her art. I know her well, and I know that she is a beautiful painter. She says she's been doing it for 10 years. Trust me, she is great, and I'll do my best to see if I can get any links in the description to Paige's work. If not, I'm going to do my best again to try and get her on the show to talk about her painting. Although everyone obviously has an avenue for them to create. So do message the page again if you want to talk about the work you do. Maybe you are an artist of some description and you want to find an avenue to talk about your art. If that's you, contact the page, because we might be able to get you on the show to talk about it in a lot more detail than we do usually when it comes to comments and sound bites, as we get so many of our guests talking about their muses. George again messages in on Facebook. We've had you message in for a few times in a row, George. Thank you so very much for messaging in. I met George through playwriting. Great guy, great work. Hope to see some more of his plays soon. It's creative expression, something that evokes an emotion upon experiencing it. I'd even go so far to say that art and entertainment are the end products of civilization. I like that last bit especially because we haven't touched on that yet. The idea of it reflecting your society and where you live. It's the footprint we're going to leave behind. It's the last thing. It's the entertainment as well. And I like that idea that it is the product. It shows what it's like living in this age. So when people in the future will think back to our time, they can see what we did. And that's very empowering for me. Now we go over to Instagram, just 2 messages on Instagram. One from Ashley. Ashley, first time messaging in. Thank you so much for contacting the page. Ashley says, the creation of something that will last after you're gone. And just touched on it with George there as well. I like that image that, similar to like what happened with Van Gogh, you create and then it's appreciated later. It means that your work can be taken in at any point. There's so much to consume. And there's so much for the context of a time that has now passed? What will the words I'm saying now sound like to someone who may be listening in 50 or 70 years? Very different, I imagine, but I'm not 100% sure. And interestingly today I was in a meeting and someone who does publishing brought in some old magazine publishing work that they did from the late 90s. And I was sort of around the era I was born in. And it was so interesting to see what magazines from this time looked like, how things had changed, what things were actually still quite similar, and how they look nothing like they did today. And these were like kept in mint condition from his work. And I just thought that was an incredible thing for me to see today. As of the time of recording this, we're recording in the middle of July. You'll be hearing this at the start of September. So thank you all very much for listening in. Very far away. The weather's absolutely stunning here in the middle of July. I just hope that it's grand where you are in September. Now, going to our final comment, we had Dan message in. Dan said, "Art is a gift that you give to the world." Thank you so much for messaging it in, Dan. Art is a gift that you give to the world. And I like the idea of picturing your art as a gift. It's like something you are putting out to people that you didn't have to do it, but you've given it. It's like a present, like at Christmas maybe. You've given out something, a piece of you, something very personalised. Personalised presents are like my favourite thing in the world to give, to make a present for someone that is very personal to what you have in terms of connection with that person. And art is that gift you give to the planet. An interesting point also that Shami brought up in the meditation episode was a form of meditation through walking, where it isn't about you putting your footprint on the planet, but it giving back to you and giving you the energy up through the floor. And I think both of these statements, despite being very different, are very nice ideas. You're giving to the world, and the world is giving back to you as well through your expression. And I think that's why, because Dan also studies film in Canterbury. I know him through that, and I imagine for everyone else who's studying some form of highly creative narrative subject will understand this. And I don't even just mean the specific normal creative fields. I know people who work in mechanics that have actually managed to make some form of beautiful imagery. I'll briefly touch on a story that my friend Joel told me. I know this is a bit off subject, but and Joel won't mind me mentioning this. He etched into his anvil, because he's a blacksmith, a song recommendation for a radio show, and then tweeted it into the station, and then they played his song choice and retweeted his anvil engraved song recommendation. And that absolutely lit up my day. Joel knows I work in radio. It wasn't for where I was working that he was messaging in, but he sent it to me and said, "Max, you'll probably like this." And that was just so amazing to see, because he put a smile on my face. It sounded like he put a smile on the presenter's face who he was talking to. And I just love that image, don't you? The idea of, he's a blacksmith. You might be thinking that isn't as creative, but he's shown me some of the things he's been making. He makes models, things for himself. It's a creative expressionism. We had Dan on the podcast last week. You heard him talking about his Connect's French Renaissance buildings. By the way, he sadly wasn't able to get pictures of those, so we're just going to have to get him to redo the whole hobby again, aren't we? But he made, French Renaissance buildings out of Connects of all things. And I thought that's such a niche artistic form. And even though he wasn't able to share the pictures, it shared something. It meant a lot to him. It was great for me to hear. It lightened my day. And it was just a touching topic. So, to round up this week's episode of the My Generation podcast, I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and just briefly go into local impact before we summarise what we've been talking about here today. I want to talk about just one or two places that you can go in Canterbury more specifically, because it's focused to where I am, as we're quite a Kent-based show. Although again, if you're listening and you're not from Kent, thank you very much for listening. Do subscribe as well, because I'm sure there's amazing places where you are. And if you're not from Kent, definitely let me know in the comments what amazing places you can go to experience art that I haven't touched on yet. Now, the Marlowe Theatre have a exhibition at their Kit building, which is free every weekend and worth exploring. They have also quite a lot of obscure pieces on in that building, as well as their studio space, which go under the radar, as theatre can traditionally seem like quite a high-end art form with big, elaborate performances, but the Marlowe do specifically do really small, contained ones. And there's obviously the Curzon Cinema, which show really great, contemplative, unique films, the type that don't get shown anywhere else. And also the Beaney Museum, one of my favourite buildings in the whole of Canterbury. It's a really old-looking building, beautiful, tall building, amazing architecture, and I'd recommend going and visiting the Beaney if you can get to Canterbury. As far as I'm aware, it's free entry with donations open. I definitely also recommend donating because they're an amazing, amazing place. They hold loads of events, and there's just so much to look at there. I've been there a few times, and every time I go, I feel like I get something a little bit different. So if you want to explore museums, there's so many in Kent. I went to Brighton for a bit, and even though that isn't Kent, it's East Sussex, they have the Toy Museum, which was amazing for me. I got to see some beautiful train model sets. Oh, that was just joyous. I got to see some amazing old trains. I got to see what toy train manufacturing was like from the early days. I loved that. There were so many amazing museums in Brighton. And just explore new art, things you maybe haven't considered. Check out the book that I've mentioned in the description. Really recommend it. I've only just got through the first few chapters, but that page about companionship really compelled me to turn on the mic and start recording today. Really appreciate your time, as ever, listening to this episode. I know, again, it's a slightly shorter one than before, but last week's episode with Dan was over an hour, I believe. And so it's great to just vary it up, have some much longer form discussions where we go across so many stories, and then some more brief ones like this. But let me know which ones you prefer. Longer, more shorter form. Again, trying to vary up and keep the podcast to your taste. And again, all comments are welcome regarding this subject because there's so much to say about it. What's your favourite piece of art? I could ask 1,000,001 questions, and I really, really want to revisit this subject, especially from a philosophical standpoint, as it does overlap with some of the previous podcast episodes we've had, and go in more detail with this. We could have almost a whole series of art-based podcasts, and I'd argue that a lot of the ones we've had so far have had just the tip of the iceberg on what art means in most of them, I'd say, as I was really happy with the quote on the 12th episode of the podcast where we went over football and why I love it. And I referred to an article which described football as painting a picture on the pitch, and it just paints such a great image, players running dynamically, cutting across each other. It's just, that's like how I like to see football. So again, message if you are able to, because we want to get all your thoughts in. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the My Generation podcast, and tune in next week where we're back to episodes with guests. We have so many great episodes lined up. I'm going to keep it very ambiguous as to what we've got lined up just at the moment, but we have got 2 guests booked already to be recorded throughout July and August to bring to you throughout all of winter. And have a great rest of your day and onward journey. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you next week in the next episode of the My Generation podcast.